Welcome to the Taxpayer Podcast, a podcast production by the Taxpayer. For more informative discussion on tax law, please visit our website to learn more about the Taxpayer Journal.
Hi, Peter. Nice to see you again.
You too.
First time in 2025. Let's hope we do so regularly this year. I'm sure we will. This, as always, is an unrehearsed conversation, but we did discuss the idea of talking about tax avoidance. And I said I would just kick off with a couple of general remarks. The word GAAR, G-A-A-R, which stands for General Anti-Avoidance Rule, seems to have come into full sway now. I have to confess that in my case, it took me about 10 years before I hated that word in the beginning, but now I quite like it. So either I'm getting old, which of course I am, but also it's quite nice. I once bumped into someone at a specialist tax court, tax chambers in London, and they just introduced an anti-avoidance provision in the UK, and this guy was going on about the GAAR. So I thought, okay, well, we've had one for a long time. It's time I got with it. Okay, so if we're talking about the GAAR, it's Section 80A of the Income Tax Act, and through to Section 80 capital A through to 80 capital L. And there are a couple of necessary definitions in Section 80 capital L. The first one is an arrangement, and an arrangement is defined to mean any transaction, operation, scheme, agreement, understanding, whether enforceable or not, including all the steps therein or parts thereof, blah, blah, blah. So it's very wide. Then there's an avoidance arrangement. So you start off with an arrangement, then an avoidance arrangement means any arrangement that but for this part results in a tax benefit. So that any arrangement that would, but for these avoidance provisions, result in a tax benefit is called an avoidance arrangement. And then when we get to paragraph 80 capital A, it talks about an impermissible avoidance arrangement, which I suppose, and this thought's occurring to me for the first time, that kind of implies that not all avoidance arrangements are impermissible. Nice little point that. I'd never thought of that before. I mean, we know that it's permissible, that certain ones are permissible, but linguistically I haven't noticed it like that. So there are differences between the old provisions when it was Section 103, subsection 1 of the Income Tax Act. And if I can remember, I'm speaking now strictly from memory, it referred to a transaction, operation, or scheme. There was similarly a requirement for solely or mainly for the purpose of obtaining a tax benefit. Then there's the question of abnormality, etc. And then there's the purpose requirement. So it's the transaction, operation, or scheme has the effect of producing a tax benefit. It was done for that purpose, and it's abnormal, etc. And now it's a little bit more complicated, but it more or less follows the same thing. Well, from what we've already said, an avoidance arrangement means any arrangement that but for this part results in a tax benefit. Curiously, there used to be a definition of tax benefit in Section 80L, but it's now been deleted from there, and it's now in Section 1 of the Act, I suppose, because it's relevant to other sections as well. And I'm sure you're going to say a lot more about this, but tax benefit is defined to mean, it's a very short definition. It simply says tax benefit includes any avoidance, postponement, or reduction of any liability for tax. Now, there's more that can be said about that, but let's leave it there. So the whole idea of a tax benefit is central to the whole GAAR, if that's what we want to call it. Do you want to take it from there, or shall I? Or
I think just to come in there, Trevor, thanks for that. And I think, as you say, there's in order to see whether the anti-avoidance provisions apply, I think the main things, as you've summarized, are: is there an transaction arrangement or scheme, and is there a tax benefit, and is the sole or main purpose to obtain the tax benefit? And then lastly, is it abnormal? And I wanted to start off looking in detail at the tax benefit concept. So I find, Trevor, that the tax avoidance rules are, in a way, sort of simple if you look at them, but they're widely misunderstood in terms of how people apply them to transactions. And I think the first error people make is in tax benefit. They assume if there's any kind of tax advantage, there must be a tax benefit. But of course, as you said, it's a defined term. And there's quite a lot of case law on this. One of the leading cases is Smith versus CRR 1964, old appellate division case. And they had said that tax benefit means to get out of the way of, to escape, to prevent an anticipated liability for tax on income. The way I think about it is, you sidestep an anticipated tax liability. You step aside from tax as a taxpayer. And this test, the Smith test, which, by the way, didn't accept the narrower version of tax benefit in King's case. So note to viewers, don't quote King's case. Smith's case effectively replaced the concept of tax benefit, or the meaning of tax benefit. And there's been a whole lot of cases since then. Most recently, interesting, people think of Sasol oil as a substance or simulation case, but it also dealt with the GAAR provisions. And it looked at a tax benefit and what did a tax benefit mean. And it held that there was no tax benefit in Sasol because the transactions didn't have the effect of taxpayers stepping aside from an anticipated tax liability. And I just want to give you an example of it, because if you think about it in very simple terms, if you have a company that's got money invested in debt instruments and it's earning interest on those, and then somebody comes along to the director of the company and says, "No, you're crazy, stop what you're doing, liquidate those investments and go and invest in preference shares instead." And the company does that and invests in preference shares, now gets a tax-exempt dividend. That's a perfect example of sidestepping an anticipated tax liability. The company had done nothing, would have continued earning interest, withdrew the money and invested in preference shares. So it sidestepped an anticipated tax liability. It's stepped aside from tax. So my sense of how do you test if there's a tax benefit? You look at the transactions that are actually entered into, and then you say, if you didn't enter into those transactions, what would you have done? And you test what, as a factual matter, the taxpayer would have done if it hadn't entered into the transaction it entered into. And maybe it would have done nothing. In my example, the company would have continued to earn interest income. And you say, if you hadn't entered into the transactions that you did enter into, would you have suffered tax? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then you've got a tax benefit. What I don't think you can do, this is where people go wrong, and it kind of comes from the Aussies, of course, who come up with things like counterfactual tests. And what they do, and I think SARS to some extent has latched onto this, is come up with a world of, or a universe of transactions that you could have entered into hypothetically and said, why did you choose this one? Why didn't you choose that one? Why didn't you choose that one? That's irrelevant for tax benefit. It might be relevant for purpose, but it's irrelevant for tax benefit. Tax benefit, you just look at the transaction actually entered into and the transaction that would have been entered into if you hadn't entered into that transaction. Simple as that. And I think, as I say, there's people skip over tax benefit. They assume a tax benefit sometimes when there's not. And of course, if there's no tax benefit, law doesn't apply. You're out on the first leg. So, interested in your thoughts on that, but I think that for me is like an important starting point. In terms of this whole, are you into GAAR or aren't you? Don't assume there's a tax benefit.
Well, can I just make a small comment in that regard? So, listening to you, what I'd say that the operative word there is anticipated.
Mm.
There must be an anticipated tax benefit. if you do something and the Income Tax Act gives you a deduction for something, are you anticipating a tax benefit in circumstances where the Act says, no, there's no tax payable here? I would say that, it's perhaps artificial to talk about it in the abstract, but there might be circumstances in which you'd say, no, I wasn't avoiding a tax benefit. I wasn't avoiding a liability for tax because the Act makes this deductible, therefore there is no liability for tax.
And also, like the rollover provisions as well, like, I mean, similar kind of thing.
Yes, I mean, could the legislature honestly have intended that something which is granted, like rollover relief by the legislation, can be attacked under the tax avoidance provisions? It would be absurd.
And yet you kind of see it. That's why I think these provisions are often misunderstood and so important. And you do see SARS using the GAAR provisions on a regular basis. And we're going to come on, Trevor, later about alternative, how to be an alternative to other technical attacks. So I really think it's a critical sort of part of our tax law. And of course, if there is a tax benefit, then you move on to the purpose test. So then you say, was the sole or main purpose of the taxpayer to obtain the tax benefit? What was the purpose? Now, the elephant in the room, and can you believe that this elephant is still in the room since 2006 when 103 was replaced by Section 80A, is whether this is a subjective or objective test. And the reason is because there's been no case law on the provisions of Section 80A in respect of the sole or main purpose and whether it's subjective or objective. And SARS argues vehemently that it's objective. And Trevor, I'm guessing, because as you say, we don't rehearse this stuff, I'm guessing you and certainly me are going to say, hang on, it's of course, it's a subjective test. And here we are, 20 years later.
No. There is a comparatively recent SCA decision, Supreme Court of Appeal. I can't remember the judge's name, but it's the ABSA case in the Supreme Court of Appeal where the judge said it's a subjective test.
And Michael Gainish has got a part heard matter, but I always tease him and say it's not going to be fully heard because I think cynically it's in SARS's view not to hear that it's subjective. But just to explain SARS's view as well. So they look at the wording of Section 80A, and the wording is an avoidance arrangement is an impermissible avoidance arrangement if its sole or main purpose. So they say it's clear. Is the sole or main purpose of the impermissible avoidance arrangement to obtain the tax benefit? And I'm saying, hang on, an arrangement can't have a purpose. Why not? Because purpose is a subjective question of fact. An arrangement is an arrangement, it's a defined term, but you need to look at, work out what someone's purpose is. You've got to find a taxpayer, and you've got to say, was the taxpayer's purpose, sole main purpose, to obtain the tax benefit? You can't look at the arrangement, you can't look at the series of contractual agreements or whatever it is. That can't have a purpose.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, only a person or a company or an entity can have a purpose. So the problem is when SARS reads that too literally. I mean, an agreement might be evidence of what the party's purpose is. So it might play a role, or it would play a role in determining what the purpose is, but it's never the agreement's purpose. Even if the agreement says our purpose in doing this is the following, the our is not the agreement, it's the people involved.
Exactly. And Trevor, as you said, Section 103 talked about a transaction, operation, or scheme was entered into or carried out solely or mainly for the purpose. So their wording is slightly different, but as you say, you need to read the language, context, and purpose. You can't read it too literally and give it this, what I think is a legally incorrect interpretation where you're looking at some sort of objectivity. And before 103, I only go back as far as 103, but before 103, there was section 90, and then there were various other sections. And the GAAR provisions have changed over time. And at some point, I sort of back in them. And if you go back, for example, to the 1950s, it was sole or one of the main purposes. It wasn't just sole or main purpose, sole or one of the main purposes. And the wording was quite similar to what it is now. And there was lots of case law of the court saying it's a subjective test. So I think if one tracks back, it's always been a subjective test, and the wording has been different, and there is a subtle difference between 103 and section 80A. There have also been other versions that have been closer to 80A than 103 on this aspect, and it's always been unquestioned by our legislature that it's a subjective test. But this is a massive point, Trevor. It really is, because objective. You can see that's much more favorable to SARS, because now you can't lead evidence as to the purpose of a taxpayer.
I think Judge Corbett made the point in Gallagher's case that if you read purpose as being objective, then what's the difference between purpose and effect? Section 103.1 spoke about purpose and effect. Section 88 talks about purpose, and then there is an avoidance arrangement is an arrangement that results. So it's use the word result rather than effect, but it has the same meaning. If I can just advance one thought, the fact that tax benefit means the avoidance, reduction, or postponement of a liability for tax, and the courts have said, and I don't know if anyone has ever disputed this, that it refers, as you said, to an anticipated liability for tax. The very fact that it's an anticipated liability for tax says something about the subjective nature of the purpose. That ties in with it being subjective. If it were objective, then why would it have to be anticipated?
Other interesting one on this point is section 80G, which provides a presumption of purpose. So it basically says an avoidance arrangement is presumed to have been entered into or carried out for the sole or main purpose of obtaining a tax benefit unless and until the party obtaining the tax benefit proves that the tax benefit was not the sole or main purpose. It's the onus on the party obtaining the tax benefit, not the arrangement.
Yes.
I read that and I kind of thought, hang on, this section 80G, you always think that is adverse to the taxpayer, and it is, because it puts the onus on the taxpayer. But there's a really important piece in there talking about party obtaining the tax benefit, which is the taxpayer, not the arrangement. Party, that particular party, must prove that obtaining the tax benefit was not the sole or main purpose. And I really thought, hang on.
If the test were objective, whatever the party says about it would be irrelevant.
That's true. That's the point.
Yeah.
So this to me is quite a key thing. I think we sort of unlocked something here that I haven't really examined this in great detail before, but totally that really evidences the subjective nature of the test.
Absolutely. And if you step back from it, it's common sense as well. You're talking about that'll be subjective.
But it's a problem because SARS insists that it's objective. And so when you get all these letters of findings and things, they talk about the purpose of the arrangement. And you find yourself working in a parallel world where you sort of write back to them, you talk about the purpose of the taxpayers, and they write to you and they talk about the purpose of the arrangement. And you're like, guys, you're on the N1, we're on the N2. we're not on the same page, you're not even on the same whatever.
Yeah.
So it's a problem, and we really need proper, clear case law on this SCA case law telling us it's subjective. But Trevor, I'm just interested in your perspective on this presumption of purpose, because onus is important in tax litigation now. I mean, that is that people sort of gloss over this and say, yeah, whatever. But if it's the onus is on you to prove your purpose, then that's quite a big thing for you as a sort of a tax litigator.
No, it certainly is. Yeah.
You need to produce evidence, and lead evidence and discharge that onus.
Yeah. And just making the same point again, that shows that it's got to be subjective.
Exactly. Have you ever led evidence from an arrangement before, Trevor?
No, one of the things I was thinking of saying by way of introduction is that, I mean, after Section 80A came in, there were no cases for a long time. That seems
Yeah,
to be changing now, but for a long time, there's been a
nothing.
dearth of judicial comment on it.
It's 2006. It's not, we think it's recent, but it's not that recent.
Oh, yeah.
And then the
When
question
Um, 2006,
is
nearly 20 years.
15 years. Feels like yesterday.
Yeah.
And then the question is, what is the purpose test? And there we always go to Conhage. I think that's a sort of the leading authority on purpose.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely sort of case to sort of to explain to our listeners as well, because a company wanted to borrow money, needed funding, went to the bank. The bank said, you know what, I can lend you some money, or I can enter into a sale and leaseback. The effect of the sale and leaseback is that you raise funding, which is what you want. So the client, the taxpayer, entered into the sale and leaseback, and that gave it more benefits than it would have had if it had borrowed money on a vanilla loan basis. And this is a lovely illustration of the purpose test, because the court said, had Conhage not needed capital, read funding, there would have been no transaction at all. Conhage did not approach the bank in order to alleviate its tax burden. It did so because it needed funding, and this remained its purpose throughout the transactions. I think that's a lovely, succinct way of putting it. There was a proper commercial transaction. Conhage needed funding. It had a funding requirement. It could have entered into the transaction in a ways, and it chose the tax efficient way. So its purpose was not to obtain tax deductions, but to raise funding. That was its sole and or main purpose in relation to the transactions, was the funding requirement. And I think that's nice. Still our leading authority, 1999. Thanks, Peter Solomon. One of the
Indeed.
many cases he won on GAAR.
There's a very nice statement here. I'm just looking for it. That once you've got a purpose, a main purpose, which is not a tax benefit purpose, not the sole main purpose of obtaining a tax benefit, then the fact that you do something in a way that is more tax advantageous than otherwise doesn't change the purpose. So in other words, you are perfectly free to take the most advantageous tax option, provided that you've got another purpose which is not a tax purpose.
Exactly. Commercial purpose, the funding in the Conhage case.
You can just
And that's the big test for me. They always say when taxpayers come and ask for advice, say, purpose.
Yeah.
What is your purpose? But, of course, that's as a subjective matter.
Yeah, let me not get too hung up on that point, but it was Judge who was the judge? Judge Heffer.
Oh, yeah.
Let me find it in the summary here. He says, as far as Section 103(1) of the Act was concerned, so that was dealing with 103(1), but the same reasoning would apply here. Even if the particular type of transaction, sale and leaseback rather than loan, had been chosen solely for the tax benefits, it'd be wrong to ignore the fact that had the taxpayer not needed capital, there would have been no transaction at all. The taxpayer did not approach the bank in order to alleviate its tax burden, and did so because it was in need of capital, and this plainly remained the main purpose of the transaction. This was sufficient to render the tax avoidance provision inapplicable. Yeah, sorry, I'm just repeating what you've already said. But
no, I think it's spot on it. And even, yeah. And I suppose on abnormality, I mean, I hate abnormality tests, and one of the reasons is because they're long and vague, and 2006 changes brought in some strange pieces there. Because it used to be, in the context of business, are you entering into the transaction for bona fide business purposes? and is under the abnormality is the abnormality of rights and obligation and or obligations. So that you could sort of get your head around. The 2006 amendments brought in this concept of, does the transaction lack commercial substance? And then it goes to a whole lot of provisions dealing with commercial substance, like round tripping finance, accommodating tax parties, etc. And which are, there's no law on that stuff, and they're very hard to sort of follow. And then even worse, Trevor, you love this one, is it goes to, has there been, or is the transaction entered into as part of a misuse or abuse of the provisions of the Act? So can you explain to me how, in 5 words, how you can misuse or abuse an Act?
Best interpretation of that I've ever heard came from you. I don't know if you can remember it.
Well, that's good to be quoted on that. Did I,
If you've got a 3-year-old child who picks up the Act and starts scribbling all over it, that might be abuse of the provisions of the Act.
I've actually forgotten about that. Yeah, I think that put it quite nicely in that scene.
That's obviously something lifted from some other tax jurisdiction. And we
It's
don't
Canada.
really have any case law on that.
Blame the Canadians for this.
Yeah.
The Canadians have this concept where they say, what do they say? There's a Canada Pasco mortgage co versus Canada case. Supreme Court of Canada held that their GAAR may be applied to deny tax benefit only after it is determined that it was not reasonable to consider that tax benefit to be within the object, spirit, or purpose of the provisions allowed by the taxpayer. So they look at the object, spirit, or purpose. The client was also a friend. He said the only spirit he believes in this context is the stuff that you have a tipple of once in a while, whiskey in particular. But I thought Silk put it beautifully, because Silk says the misuse or abuse doctrine presupposes that the relevant provisions of the Act have been complied with, but that the arrangement fails an overarching test, and that it has resulted in an abuse of these provisions. The paradox is plain. How can an arrangement satisfy the provisions of the Act while simultaneously misusing or abusing them? I thought that was beautifully put.
Yeah, I agree.
Now you have to interpret the stuff. If you're looking at abnormality, if a client says, does it pass the abnormality test? You have to say, well, is there misuse or abuse of the provisions of the Act? We've got no law. We've got this strange Canada decision. So it's very hard to sort of conclude on this. I think the general my general view is, if the transaction is very simple, very vanilla, then, maybe you can get comfortable, very comfortable on the normality or abnormality. I think if a court finds against you on tax benefit and purpose, they're likely to find some element of abnormality as just a general rule. It's not really a statement of law.
Yeah, I agree. One can conceive of situations where, say, for example, a deeming provision is applied in such a way that on a certain particular set of facts, it ends up producing a benefit for the taxpayer rather than tax for the fiscus. Now, does that make it an abuse? It will depend on the facts, Some people are quite good at using tax avoidance measures to assist in tax avoidance. That implies a presupposition that, it's very, very hard to generalize about this stuff.
The Commissioner can apply the provisions to steps and or parts of an arrangement. Given 103, that wasn't specifically stated, as I recall, but you and I think always thought that they could anyway. I don't know.
It's just spelling out what the position always would have been, I think. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So you always had to test each step in the transaction as well as the transaction as a whole. And I think that's always been the case, and I think that's still the case. Now, Section 88 tells us it's the case, so that is clear. But I didn't see that as a change from 103.
I think an aspect of all of this is, and I mean, heard what you said earlier about Smith's case rather than King's case. I still like what was said in King's case, because one's got to recognize that the legislature uses tax legislation in order to encourage certain forms of behavior. So, like the venture capital companies, you've got a deduction for the cost of the shares. A more recent one, solar panels. If you know, so they grant a tax benefit in order to encourage certain forms of behavior. I mean, could you ever turn around and say, well, now you shouldn't have done that because you're obtaining a tax benefit? I mean, and there's a comment of Judge Wallace in the Bosch case. That was a case dealing with Section 8A and then Section 8C. And he said, you know, if SARS, if there's a loophole in something and SARS doesn't like it, their remedy is to amend the Act, as they do every year. That he didn't sort of square the circle with how do you relate that to tax avoidance, but it's nevertheless it recognizes that, and I think Judge Lewis in the Sassel case and in other cases, it's widely recognized, even in NWK, it was recognized that taxpayers can arrange their affairs in such a way as to pay the lawful minimum amount of tax.
100%. And I think that principle still holds, Trevor. It must still hold. The old Duke of Westminster, you can argue around the edges, but I mean, as I said, that's enshrined in Connage, and Connage is very good law, still very good law. And that for me is the choice principle. It's straight in Connage, so it's absolutely a part of our law. And it ties into the purpose test, which I think, as I say, I think that's the real aspect of the GAAR provisions that you need to hone in on and get very comfortable with if you're going to enter into a transaction. Tax benefits important, understand what that is. It's sort of main purpose, that's the biggie.
Yeah.
There's also, what else was there? Section 80B, that sort of sets out the remedies. 80 capital B sets out the remedies, draconian. If you've got an impermissible avoidance arrangement, the commissioner can recharacterize, ignore, replace taxpayers. So it gives very, very wide powers. And that ties into an earlier podcast where we talked about Section 80J, because Section 80B is so wide-ranging. The power for the commissioner, the Section 80J requires a notice from the commissioner to a taxpayer saying, hey, I'm interested in the GAAR provisions. Tell me why you think they don't apply. And as to apply, the commissioner applies his mind to the response and decide how to progress with whether to progress with that or not. And we chatted a bit about that.
One interesting aspect of which has always puzzled me, I don't think I have solutions to it, but if you look at Section 80B, it sets out all the very wide powers. So it basically empowers SARS to ignore the facts and to substitute a fiction. So it can recharacterize gross income, etc., etc. Can reallocate gross income, can deem persons or connected persons to be one and the same person, etc. But then it says in subsection 2, subject to the time limits imposed by Section 99, 100, and 104, the commissioner must make compensating adjustments that he or she is satisfied are necessary and appropriate to ensure the consistent treatment of all parties to the impermissible avoidance arrangement. And those three sections to which that is subject impose certain time limits. I often think that, typically where tax avoidance or where the GAAR is invoked by SARS, often those times will have expired anyway. So can you act in terms of Section 80B in one way, and if you were in time, that would have meant, like, for example, if they say something is taxable here or is not deductible here, well, then maybe it's not taxable in the hands of somebody else, whereas it was previously. In other words, consistent treatment. It remains a bit of a mystery to me.
Scary though, hey?
Yeah.
So as far as whether or not you have to make compensating adjustments, that feels like a minimum. But if you don't, because as you say, if you're out of time, so you don't have to make compensating adjustments, but you can still invoke Section 80B against a particular taxpayer in a pretty scary world.
Yes, and it raises the question, if you're out of time for making compensating adjustments, should that influence the way that you behave? Well, I think maybe it should, but I doubt whether in practice it would.
And SARS often argues, in terms of the time limits and prescription, that they don't apply because there's fraud, misrepresentation, or most often non-disclosure material fact. So there was a non-disclosure material fact. If I'd known that particular fact at the time of assessment, I'd have assessed in a different way. I didn't know it, so I didn't assess in a different way. So all bets are off. I can come back after 10 years or whatever, more than 3 years. So it's quite often the case that you are out of those statutory limitation periods of 3 or 5 years. So yeah, an interesting point. So it's a minefield, Trevor, that's for sure. And it's, as I say, something that people tend to kind of forget about. If you're writing an opinion, it's the last thing you address in your opinion. Maybe it should be the first thing in terms of any opinion that under sort of the GAAR provisions, because if you've got a problem with GAAR, you've got a big problem in terms of Section 80B.
Well, maybe the advice one can give is people must try as far as possible to ensure that there is if I can call it an absolving main purpose, which has got nothing to do with tax. You're doing it for good commercial reasons. Yeah,
I agree. Completely agree with that. As always, it's nice to chat, Trevor. I can see you've got a nice new microphone there as well. So I must catch up with that on technology. Next time.
Good. Okay. Peter and I have chatted about doing these podcasts more regularly. So we're going to try and do one a month. Let's hope we can keep to that this year.
Definitely.
Provisionally, the last Thursday of every month we'll do it, and it'll be distributed, let's say, the following week. But time will tell, but that's the intention.
For sure. So it's New Year's, time for New Year's resolutions, Trevor. So yeah, absolutely. But as always, very nice chatting.
Oh, nice to chat to you too.
Yeah. Cheers, then.
Speak again soon. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Taxpayer is hosted by the editors of the Taxpayer Journal, Trevor, Emslie, and Peter Dax. For more information on our journal and other products, please visit our website at Taxpayer.Co.Za. Each of our episodes is CPD certified. To claim your CPD points, please visit our website. Thank you for listening to the Taxpayer Podcast. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platform or on our website at Taxpayer.Co.Za. Please like and subscribe on YouTube and rate our podcast on your podcast platform of choice.